A gray, misty dawn blanketed the prairie as wind howled through the rotting fence of the abandoned farm. Caleb Stratton had just set foot on the land left to him by his late uncle. He had not even begun to unpack. His boots, still dusty from the battlefield, landed heavily on the hardened ground as he made his way to the door of the old barn. The hinges screamed with a chilling screech as he pushed the door open. Pale light crept in and then Caleb froze. 8 bodies hung limply from the rafters, ropes pulled tight around their necks. Their shadows stretched long across the barn floor. Wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, making the thin bodies sway gently, like dead ghosts caught dancing in the twilight. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. His years on the battlefield had shown him hundreds of deaths, but nothing had ever hit him like this. This was not a war zone. This was a farm, a place where he had hoped to begin a new life. Then he noticed what made his blood run cold. From one of the hanging figures came a faint moan, soft and thin like a breeze, eyes barely open, fluttering weakly. They were not dead. Caleb stepped back half a pace, heart pounding wildly in his chest. He began to question the decaying barn, this place that now held in its grasp the fate of 8 Apache girls. The scene shocked him to his core. Caleb Stratton stood frozen in front of the horrifying scene. The smell of rotting wood, dried grass, and faint traces of dried blood hung in the air, choking him. His calloused hands gripped the handle of the old hunting knife strapped to his side. Suddenly, memories came flooding back: battlefields, fallen comrades, and the hollow emptiness that had followed him for the past 10 years. Caleb had once been a cavalryman. He survived when his entire unit was wiped out, returning home with a body full of scars and a heart eaten away from the inside. His wife and daughter had died in a vicious plague. Since then, he had drifted like a ghost, with only whiskey and darkness for company. Then, a letter arrived, a will from his late uncle, leaving him a farm on the edge of Dry Creek. Caleb saw it as his final shot at redemption. He hoped to find peace out there on the wild prairie, rebuild the house, mend the fences, and live out his days in quiet solitude. But that hope turned to ashes the moment he stepped through the barn door. The farm he had inherited was nothing short of a living graveyard. The fences were broken, the roof sagging. And now, at its heart, 8 Apache girls hung by the neck like vengeful spirits. Caleb moved toward them slowly, each step heavier than the last. He could hear a rasping breath from one of the bodies. A pair of dark eyes cracked open, barely clinging to life. His heart pounded, and in that instant, he saw his daughter again, just a little girl, once gasping for air, begging for help with her eyes, before the sickness stole her away. His grip tightened on the knife, his jaw clenched. He could not just stand there. In that moment, Caleb understood this inheritance was not just a gift from fate. Maybe it was a trap, a twist of destiny dragging him back to the edge between life and death, between justice and evil. The barn door still creaked in the wind, and the 8 swaying figures seemed to call out to him, forcing a choice. He could walk away, leave it all behind. Or he could step forward and cut the ropes, choking the life out of each and every one of them. Caleb drew a long breath. The knife in his hand felt as heavy as a mountain, but for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he had to do. The knife in Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he looked up at the rafters. 8 bodies hung limply, bare feet turning a ghastly shade of purple, the ropes digging into their skin, leaving streaks of dried blood. One pair of eyes flickered open, blinking rapidly, a faint glimmer of a plea shining through. "Oh, Lord," Caleb whispered, then rushed forward. He wrapped his arms around the first body and slashed the rope clean through. The girl collapsed, heavy and ice cold. Caleb dropped to his knees, lowering her onto the straw-covered floor. Her breath was faint, but still there. He struck her back hard, and a rough, rattling groan escaped her lips. Without hesitation, he moved on. The knife sliced through rope after rope, each lifeless figure dropping heavily onto his calloused arms. Sweat poured down his forehead and spine, even in the morning chill. With every rope he cut, his heart lurched, terrified he might be too late. When the last girl hit the ground, Caleb was gasping for breath. He dragged each one out of the barn's moldy shadows and into the dry earth bathed in early sunlight. Faint warmth began to return to their pale cheeks. One of the girls opened her eyes. Her cracked lips quivered, and in a mixture of broken Apache and scattered English, she whispered, "Please, do not leave. Stay, just for tonight." Caleb knelt beside her, his pale gray eyes locking onto hers. In that moment, he saw his daughter again, those same pleading, fragile eyes, just before they faded away. It felt like something reached inside and squeezed his heart. He quickly pulled each frail body into the cabin. The small room reeked of mold, but it was the only shelter with a roof. He lit a fire, poured water from a wooden bucket, and coaxed it into their mouths one sip at a time. Some coughed harshly, but their throats took it in, their eyes beginning to open. The fire crackled, casting flickering light across their ghostly faces. They were no longer hanging phantoms, they were fragile lives, clawing for each breath. Caleb sat there, his hands raw and bloodied from the ropes, eyes fixed on every single one of them. He did not know who they were, or why they had been left to die in that barn. But he knew one thing for certain. From the moment his knife touched that first rope, he felt that trouble was coming, and it had its sights set on him. Night fell quickly over the prairie. Inside the crumbling cabin, the fire flickered like a faint heartbeat of life. 8 Apache girls lay huddled around it, their bodies trembling, their breaths sometimes strong, sometimes fading. Caleb sat in the middle of them, his large frame sunken into the air thick with sweat, smoke, and the scent of burned rope fiber. He took out his knife and cut strips from an old shirt of his, carefully wrapping them around their necks. The red marks were still deep, some even bleeding slightly. Each time he touched them, they flinched, eyes flickering open in panic, as if the noose was still around their throats. Caleb whispered softly, his voice rough but calm, trying to soothe. "It is all right. There are no more ropes here." They could not fully understand him, but something in his tone softened their eyes. He offered what little water was left, letting it touch their cracked lips. One girl drank greedily and began coughing, but held the wooden bowl tight, her eyes shining with gratitude. Another turned away, refusing it, tears sliding down her face without a word. Caleb did not press her. He simply placed the bowl by her side. In the firelight, he studied them. 8 faces, each different, but all carrying the same imprint, youth marked by pain. Some still held fire in their eyes, some trembled like children, and others sat in silence, as still as statues. Caleb's thoughts drifted to his little girl. He remembered her burning with fever, her tiny hand clutching his shirt, eyes begging for protection. That memory now layered over the scene before him, tightening his chest like a vice. One of the older girls, perhaps the eldest, slowly pushed herself up. Her dark, deep-set eyes locked onto Caleb's, wary and watchful. Her voice was hoarse, but managed to form a few broken words in English. "You, why help?" Caleb fell silent. It was a simple question, but it reached into the depths of his soul. He looked down at his hands, smeared with blood and rope fiber, then back at the young girls breathing weakly around the fire. "At last," he answered, "because I cannot bear to see those pleading eyes, and do nothing." The words dropped into the quiet, where only the fire crackled softly. The eldest girl watched him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Just a small nod, but like a single thread stitching together 2 distant worlds. Caleb stayed with them through the night. It felt as if his fate, and the fate of these 8 girls, had somehow already been written, long before he ever stepped onto this land. Closing narration for video. I am deeply grateful for your presence here. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of dusty afternoons and the echo of horse hooves deep in your chest, then I hope you will subscribe to my channel, so that each day we can sit together again. And I will share with you another tale from the Wild West. The fire inside the cabin was just strong enough to keep the darkness at bay. Caleb sat with his back against the wooden wall, eyes heavy but refusing to sleep. The 8 girls lay curled around the flames, their breathing slowly becoming steadier. He thought that, at the very least, tonight would be quiet. But the prairie never lets anyone rest easy. The sound of hooves broke through the silence, steady and heavy, like war drums. Caleb snapped upright, hand clutching the old Winchester rifle by his side. Through the crack in the door, he saw fire spark on the horizon. A single flicker at first, then a long line blazing like a serpent of flame crawling toward them. The cabin door creaked open. The eldest girl bolted upright, her dark eyes flaring with intensity. She whispered urgently in her native tongue. The other girls, though exhausted, sat up in alarm, fear rising with every breath. Caleb could not understand all the words, but he understood one thing with certainty. They knew who was coming. The hoofbeats grew louder. The ground trembled. Then torches erupted around the edge of the farm. More than 60 Apache riders emerged in the firelight, circling the cabin. Steam blew from their horses' nostrils. Feathers quivered in the wind. Their eyes, bright with fury, bore into the rotting wood as if they could burn the cabin down with their gaze alone. An arrow struck the ground in front of the porch, quivering violently in the dry earth. Caleb stepped back, Winchester raised across his chest, cold sweat trailing down his temple. Behind him, the cabin door shuttered. The 8 girls huddled close, their eyes wide with terror. One young warrior rode forward, raising his bow. His voice cracked through the night, echoing in Caleb's chest. "Return them. Every man who touched my daughter must pay in blood." Oh! Dozens of arrows were drawn back, tight as if a storm were about to explode. The wind carried red dust. Flames threw shadows of horses and warriors across the cabin walls, forming a living mural of vengeance. Caleb clenched his teeth. He had no words to explain. Even if he spoke, would they believe him? One thing was clear: if he stepped outside now, the truth might be ignored, but death would not be. Inside the cabin, the eldest girl rose to her feet and staggered toward the door. Determination burned in her eyes, as if her gaze alone could speak for them all. Caleb reached out, trying to stop her, shaking his head, but she placed a thin hand against his chest and met his eyes with quiet resolve. "You saved us. Now let us save you." Outside, the circle closed tighter. Everything hung on the edge of a spark, ready to ignite into a sea of blood. The pounding of hooves shook the ground, sending red dust spiraling into the air. Dozens of warriors stood with bows drawn, spears glinting in the torchlight. Death hung in the air, just one breath away. Then, from within the circle, a tall figure rode forward. It was the chief. He wore a deerskin cloak embroidered with tribal patterns, long feathers draping over his shoulders. A deep scar carved across his face, and his black eyes glinted like blades. The entire war party fell silent, parting to let him through. He did not need to shout. His presence alone pressed down on the night like iron. His horse came to a halt in front of the cabin. The chief spoke, his voice low and heavy, each word striking the earth like a hammer. "White man, what have you done to my daughter?" Caleb stood in the doorway, the Winchester rifle raised, but heavy in his grip. Behind him, the 8 girls trembled, their eyes filled with absolute fear. For a moment, he considered lowering the gun, surrendering to whatever fate awaited. But then the memories of the night before came rushing back, cutting the ropes, cradling cold bodies, hearing the faint moans and whispered pleas. "Please do not leave us." He took a deep breath. His voice was hoarse, but it carried through the silence. "I saved them. If I had arrived any later, they would be dead. I did not hurt anyone." Then, a murmur swept through the warriors, but the chief's gaze never wavered. His eyes burned with doubt and fury. He raised a hand, and 3 warriors stepped forward, bows drawn, arrows pointed directly at Caleb. Just then, the eldest girl staggered out from the cabin. The rope burns around her neck still showed deep and dark, but her eyes burned with fire. She shouted something in Apache, then turned to Caleb, using all her strength to form broken English. "He saved us." Then, a gasp rippled through the war party. Eyes wavered. Some of the arrows lowered. The chief slowly turned toward his daughter. His expression faltered for just a heartbeat. But then he turned back to Caleb, his voice cold as steel. "If you truly saved her, then prove it. Who is the one who did this?" Caleb stood frozen. He did not yet know what to say, but in the eyes of the girls, he saw the truth waiting ready to burst forth, desperate to be spoken. This moment was the edge of a blade. His fate and the fate of the entire farm hung by a thread thinner than the rope he had cut just the night before. The blazing torches cast long shadows across the cabin wall. More than 60 warriors remained in their battle stances. But now, every eye was fixed on the group of Apache girls collapsed behind Caleb. The eldest sister, rope burn still raw on her neck, limped forward another step. She raised her hand, pointed at the red scar on her throat, then turned her finger toward Caleb. Her voice was rough, breaking apart into fragments of English. "Not him. Different white man. Morrison." And That name dropped into the night like a stone tossed into still water. The entire circle of warriors stirred. Some growled. Others whispered urgently to one another. The chief's eyes flashed, sharp with both suspicion and fury. The eldest sister continued, now speaking rapidly in her native tongue, her voice filled with pain and urgency. She told them, Morrison, the greedy landowner from town, had sent his men to capture them, to hang them in the rafters of this very barn. He wanted to spread fear, to trick the Apache into believing Caleb was to blame, and remove the last obstacle standing in the way of taking the entire valley for himself. As her story was translated, broken and halting, by a warrior who understood some English, the circle exploded with rage. Spears were raised high, arrows hissed through the air. But this time, they were no longer aimed at Caleb. Chief Tacona, his face carved with years of battle and loss, stepped forward. He stared at Caleb for a long time, his eyes dark and deep as a canyon. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand. The signal was clear. Bows came down. The circle loosened. You are not the enemy, he said, voice low and gravelly. You saved my daughter, but know this. By doing so, you have tied yourself to a war that has no end. Caleb exhaled, his shoulders sagging as if a mountain had been lifted from his back. He looked at the 8 girls' faces pale, but eyes burning bright in the firelight. They were no longer ghosts hanging from rafters. They were alive, and their words had shifted the course of his fate. That night, as the tribe slowly withdrew into the darkness and only the wind howled across the plains, Caleb sat silently on the cabin's porch. He knew now. Morrison had lit a fuse far greater than he imagined. And Caleb, the man who once only longed for peace. The next night, the prairie wind howled violently. Caleb had just dozed off when the thunder of hooves returned this time, not from Apache warriors. From the road that led into town, flickering torchlight appeared, followed by echoing, hideous laughter. Morrison, the bloated land baron, sat firmly atop his horse, his black cloak whipping in the wind. He had brought nearly 30 gunmen with him, their rifles gleaming in the firelight. Morrison scowled and shouted, his voice booming. Caleb Stratton, this land is mine. I was the one who sent you that fake will. This little game is over. Now I will burn you and that worthless farm to the ground. He threw his arm forward. His men roared and hurled flaming torches at the dry fences. Fire erupted instantly, licking across rotted wood, casting a red glow across the sky. Caleb grabbed his Winchester, eyes flashing toward the cabin where the 8 girls trembled inside. He shouted, Get down, stay inside. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the air, slamming into the wooden walls. Caleb dove to the ground, firing back. His first shot dropped one of the torch throwers. The yard became a hellscape: flames, smoke, gunshots, and panicked horses. Then, from the shadows, a thunderous cry rose like a storm. Over 50 Apache riders burst forth, bows drawn, spears glinting. They had returned, just as Chief Tacona had warned. This was no longer Caleb's fight alone. The battle exploded into chaos. Arrows ripped through the air, finding their marks in enemy chests. Spears slashed wide. Horses screamed. Red dust rose like a sandstorm. Caleb fired until his rifle clicked empty, then pulled his knife and charged. He was no longer a wandering ghost looking to disappear. He fought like a man defending justice, defending freedom. Morrison screamed, his eyes bulging as his men fell one by one. He turned his horse, trying to flee, but a young warrior's arrow found his back. Morrison let out a strangled cry and tumbled from the saddle, his bloated body swallowed by fire and dust. When the last gunshot faded, only the wind remained howling across the scorched earth. The farm smoldered. Fences lay broken, but the cabin still stood. Inside, the 8 Apache girls were alive, their eyes glowing with gratitude and hope. Caleb stood silent among the ashes, his calloused hand gripping a bloodied knife. The firelight danced across his face, tired, but resolute. He knew, from this moment forward, he was no longer a drifting shadow. The West teaches you one thing. Land can be taken, cattle can die, but if you still have the courage to protect the innocent, then not everything is lost. Because out here, justice is not held in the hands of the powerful, it lives in the heart of those brave enough to stand tall in the storm. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you thought of this story. Drop your comments down below. Type 1 if you enjoyed this tale. And do not forget to subscribe.